All right, Monica, I think you can unmute yourself and start.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming to our discussion titled The DMA's Brussels Effect, How an EU Regulation is Reshaping Digital Markets in Brazil, Turkey, and India. My name is Monica Metz, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. But first, before I start the panel, I would like to ask Aurelian Porchois, the founding director of the GW Competition Innovation Lab, to welcome our speakers and guests.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica. So it's a great pleasure for the GW Competition Innovation Lab to host this webinar on a very important topic, as the Digital Markets Act is increasingly a source of inspirations all over the world, for good or for bad. So the GW Competition Innovation Lab started this year, so it's a very recent center at the George Washington University. And we bring together a lot of different scholars from law, from economics, from computer science, data science, to think about issues of antitrust and intellectual property right, not only in the US, but also across the globe and in developed and developing countries. So we're excited to bring together scholars to engage in a number of publications and a number of events as today's. So yeah, we look forward to engage with more scholars. And if you want to be connected, do not hesitate to visit our website, GW Competition Innovation Lab, to connect and engage. So yeah, back to you, Monica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aurelian, for your remarks. Please allow me to now introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Dario Oliveira Neto. He is the director of the Latin America Competition Advocacy Program at George Mason University and also a PhD candidate at São Paulo University in Brazil. Lila Norakish is our senior policy analyst at ITIF and also a visiting scholar and adjunct faculty at George Mason University. Hanna Stekhayeva is a knowledge counsel at Aceton and a lecturer at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, in Turkey. And finally, we have Pritika Margarita Magime, who is a postgraduate researcher and a tech policy analyst at Georgetown Center on National Security. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome. Our discussion today shall be about the Brussels effect of specifically the Digital Markets Act of the EU. As we know, EU legislation such as the GDPR, has had the power to regulate global markets by externalizing EU policies through private actions of companies and also the harmonization and legislation of third countries. So my first question would be to Lila, as she is from the EU and an expert in EU law. Do you think that a globally coordinated approach is beneficial or would be beneficial to both the EU and third countries? And what do you see as the key to the success of the Brussels effect taking place? What makes so many countries want to adopt the DMA despite its potential pitfalls?
Thank you, Monica, for introducing me and for organizing this panel. And thank you very much to Aurelian and to the GW Lab for hosting us today. I would also like to welcome our audience and thank you for tuning in today. So the DMA has become a global trend, but this is not the only way to cope with big tech. Therefore, countries should not treat the DMA as the international best practice. When it comes to economic regulation, as we know, there is no one-size-fits-all solution or policy. The Brussels effect shows how the European Union shapes the international business environment by providing standards for those who want to enter the single market. This is Brussels effect 1.0. In addition to this, by elevating standards worldwide, the EU is Europeanizing many of the policy areas, such as global commerce, data privacy, environment protection, and also antitrust. Several jurisdictions are adopting European-style regulation on these in these policy areas. This is Brussels effect 2.0. The DMA amplifies the Brussels effect 2.0 and creates an incentive for third countries to follow the European regulatory path, like it was the best practice to handle big technological companies. However, the DMA is just one international path to approach the big tech regulatory dilemma. As we know, the question was, what you asked was whether the world should follow the European approach and adopt a globally coordinated response to big tech dilemma based on the European Union's model. The answer is more complex than a simple yes or no. The first thing we have to consider is that market characteristics are very different across the countries. Not all market mirrors the structure of the European Union. Secondly, many countries lack the sophisticated antitrust enforcement regimes the European Union has built over the decades. Third, the EU already has possessed a robust competition regime even before the DMA. Finally, a political argument. Different governments have very distinct priorities when it comes to regulation. Therefore, a one-size-fits-all approach is unworkable, especially in economic-style regulations. Moreover, some countries aren't even doing anything. For example, the United States, Singapore, Taiwan. Other countries are changing the already existing ex-post laws, such as Canada, in order to adjust them to the new challenges. Some jurisdictions are adopting ex-ante approach, like the DMA. However, they are not doing it the same way as the DMA does. A good example to this is the UK's DMCC bill, or DMCC, or the proposed Brazilian bill. As mentioned, the DMA is just one of several existing models. It's pioneering, it's new, but it's not the definite solution. In addition to this, the goals of the DMA are to prevent market abuse by gatekeepers, protect consumer choice, ensure fairness, foster innovation, and enhance data privacy, all to create a more competitive and transparent digital ecosystem in the European Union. However, it does not really do any of that. The EU already has a bunch of elaborated legal packages and policy solutions for the rest of the mentioned purposes. For example, for data protection purposes, the EU has the GDPR. Moreover, it already has a bunch of treaty provisions and sector-specific laws combined with the Court of Justice practice for competition issues. For consumer protection, for example, the EU has a branch of specific laws targeting unfair practices, contractual terms, travelers' rights, and so on. To ensure fairness in the digital markets, the EU would need to delicately define what fairness means for it. In its current form, the DMA is more like a Foreign Tech Act, discouraging different foreign tech actors to provide value for European users. Since the DMA's enforcement began in March 2024, European consumers experienced some significant changes in the services provided by these gatekeepers. For example, Google limited certain integrated features like Google Maps or Google Flights from search results, causing complaints from consumers who actually find this new design less convenient. Some other companies like Apple implemented new options for third-party app stores and browsers, changing the experience with the iOS for the users. So when other jurisdictions choose to follow the European path, they often overlook that their market dynamics and their economic conditions very different from those of the EU. Consequently, the solutions that work for the EU might not work the same way for these jurisdictions. Implementing a DMA-style regulation in regions like Brazil or India can cause very different consequences and lead to different results. Instead, it risks creating an environment where there are high burdens on companies to comply, and that may deter smaller players from entering the regulatory or the competitive landscape. Ultimately, can stifle innovation too. So jurisdictions who want to adopt EU-style regulations, they might need to clarify first the specific objectives their regulation wants to achieve, and using economic regulation only if it's necessary. Moreover, examining existing legal solutions before adopting new ones can be also a wise decision, reviewing whether the current legal framework is able to address the new challenges. If such solutions exist, maybe prioritizing them over introducing unfamiliar or alien solutions like the DMA could be a good solution. Access the early impacts of the DMA is also very important, given that the DMA is still in its early phases, and even with still some changes and some challenges arising from the application of it, we don't really see all the consequences it brought in this new regulatory landscape.
Thank you so much, Lila. I'm sorry, but we should move on to the next speaker just to keep to the time. But thank you for your remarks. They were very interesting. And now I would like to hear from our expert on Turkey, because the Turkish government published a draft revision of their Competition Act in 2022, which brings major changes to the digital markets in Turkey. And this new act, in fact, might reshape the country's competitive landscape and consumer protection as well. So for Hannah, my question will be, do you think that the DMA type approach to provisions would be appropriate or necessary in Turkey specifically? And what changes are you looking forward to? What did you think about in relation to the remarks that Lila made? Thank you. We cannot hear you. You are still unmuted. So please unmute yourself and then we will be able to hear. Thank you so much.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes, thank you.
All right. Sorry for that. Thanks, Monica. Indeed, the question is very timely, and I would say this webinar as well, because the topic is rather controversial. But in the 7 minutes, I just want to directly answer your questions. All right. So what we're talking about now is the draft amendments to the Turkish competition law that are still being discussed and still to be adopted by the parliament. Right. So they're still at the stage. They're not yet here, but it's a draft. So we expect them to be adopted sometime this year, but again, this may shift. All right, so this is very, let's say, speculative issue as to the timing when this amendment may be adopted and may come into force. So in any case, we can assess the draft text of the proposed amendments and see that they are very, very much alike and very much resemble those under the DMA in terms of the definitions, in terms of obligations, in terms of the penalties, so on and so forth. To be more precise, the draft amendments, they resemble more of the German approach, right? So in terms that Turkey has chosen to make the amendments to the competition law as opposed to adopting separate regulation. So I will not go specific details of those amendments, but just answering your question about the appropriateness or the necessity of the DMA-like amendments in Turkey. In my opinion, Turkey cannot stay aside of the global trend, right? A trend towards more stringent oversight of the big tech. So there is a global consensus that big tech dominant platform requires stronger regulation to ensure fair play, to ensure fair competition for all of us, right? And the Turkish Competition Authority, it has already demonstrated a strong focus on the digital market and the big tech through monitoring the activities of those companies, through investigating them, not to mention, let's say, Google cases that are also happening in Turkey and so on. Even without such draft amendments, right, even without incorporating, say, the provisions of the DMA into national legislation yet, we see that Turkish Competition Authority relies on the enforcement of the competition law to go after such companies and to, let's say, to discipline them. However, for Turkey to remain competitive, right, and to ensure that its markets, they function fairly, I would say that adopting DMA-inspired align it with these global trends. As I said, it cannot stay away of the global trend. And we're talking here about the Brussels effect, but I would say it's indeed there is a Brussels effect, but it's kind of becoming even more global. So it's not only the EU, right? So Brussels effect spreading globally. So it's a global trend, and we have to follow them in order to let's say, stay competitive and provide more legal certainty and predictability, which is beneficial both for business and for the regulators. So, in fact, the discussion should center, should no longer be around. Do we need DMA? Do we need the DMA-like provisions, right? But rather on how DMA provision can be refined or adapted to better serve the evolving needs of the digital markets, including Turkey, right? Including all of us. So hence, rather than debating whether the DMA-style approach is necessary, the question should center on how Turkey can implement and improve upon these types of regulations, right? And this is possible by adapting those rules to its own landscape that would reflect its realities and unique features of its digital markets. So indeed, in a way, I support the position of the previous speakers, emphasizing that yes, simply, let's say, adopting DMA-like provisions is not would not be wise, right? So it only would work if such move would be adapted, right? Adapted to the national realities and to the national peculiarities of the national system. But all in all, I would say that yes, DMA type approach is indeed appropriate and necessary for Turkey. So in this context, answering the last part of your question is that in this context, we are looking forward to, we are expecting more let's say, robust regulatory framework for digital platforms, enhanced enforcement mechanism, and a greater protection for business and consumers that would ensure that the digital economy grows in a way that is fair, transparent, and innovative. Among the implications for business, right, that are to be expected, well, first of all, that's increased compliance obligations. Right, so for gatekeepers to adapt their business practices to comply with these rules. By the way, one point that I would like to emphasize here, that actually even Turkish players already nowadays, they're kind of putting effort to comply with the DMA provisions, even though it's not yet in Turkey, right, in force, but nevertheless, for them to remain competitive and to even if they plan or if they already entering the EU market, they prefer to go for already refining their policies and adapting them to the DMA, right, provision, just in case. So here we can talk about we can experience the free riding, let's say, on DMA, right? But this will not last, I believe, because as I mentioned in the beginning, Turkey at some point will actually adopt the DMA-like provisions into its competition law. And of course, the scrutiny, the regulatory scrutiny will be increased. All right, we understand that this is more burden on the companies, but on the other hand, it will provide a little bit more legal certainty, I would say, because the companies would know what exactly is expected from them. Here, the companies, I mean, the gatekeepers, right? So it's not just every company, but a selected number of those dominant players. So all in all, message here I would like to pass is that the company should start preparing for these changes, all right? Even though in anticipation of this adoption of the law changes, right, amendments, they already can start preparing themselves by simply following the DMA provisions, because those are very much would be similar in Turkey, all right? And DMA kind of serves as both the guide and the catalyst for Turkey in, let's say, modernizing its own digital market governance. That's all from my side. I hope it answered the question. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, you did. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, Hannah. This thing about how Turkey should have its own way of thinking and not just copy-paste the DMA, and also other countries should have the realities in mind when making regulation is so important, I think. But I also want to hear about Dario, how he thinks about the situation in Brazil. And specifically, if you think that there is a need for a unified approach, or you're more on Henna's side of the arguments. And I also want to ask you, what effects is the adoption of the DMA regulation likely to have on innovation, according to you?
Thank you, Monica. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this great panel. Thank you also for Aurelian and the GW Competition and Innovation Lab for organizing this great event. So first of all, since we're talking in a Brussels effect panel, I think it's important to emphasize that DMA is not the only Brussels effect, that it is quietly affecting Brazil and other Latin America countries. So for example, Brazil adopted very similar GDPR law in 2018. Nowadays, even more important than the Brazilian DMA that's being discussed in the Brazilian Congress, we have the AI Act in the Brazilian Senate, which is quite similar to the provisions that were adopted in the EU. So yeah, we do feel an affecting of Brussels effect. But going to your question, Monica, related to the DMA and the need for a unified approach. Yeah, I think that is important. As higher globalization and global economic integration, it is increasing all over the world. And as companies that are operating in multiple jurisdictions, a unified competition policy, I believe, could provide better consistency and better predictability to all the companies. And I think we can see this in competition policy, in other areas of competition law. So, for example, in hardcore cartels and leniency agreements, we have seen like this wave since from the 90s and beginning of 20s of a unified competition policy and some more use of international cooperation tools to provide consistency, not only for a country, but like for a region, and internationally speaking, to provide better predictability to the companies that maybe was involved in the same kind of discussion, but in different countries. And I believe nowadays, since we're discussing about those types of ex-ante digital market regulations, a unified approach, it is important not only for the countries, but also internationally speaking. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind, as Hannah said, that one other important principle about when you're talking about law in general is the sovereignty of the states. So if a country wants to adopt a different provision or a different type of way to regulate or to address a competition problem, it's a possibility, and a possibility that it must be known by the actors. However, as Han also addressed, each country has their own specific economic policies, priorities, and competition priorities, and each country also has specific markets that may have like a great market failure in one point, or like not that much problem in the other point. So when you're talking about sovereignty of states, it's also a good point to have in mind that while we do have the need, or it would be good to have a unified approach on the one hand. On the other hand, we may have some differences, and those differences may impact the way that the country is providing their services and their products as a company is providing their service and their products in a country. And about the effects of the adoption of DMA style in Brazil, it's one thing that I cannot say that I have a final answer. I believe no one really does. This would be more like an empirical question to see it. And a good thing to be in this position of watching how the DMA and other ex-ante regulation provisions being adopted in other countries, to see what's being good and what's being bad and what should like adopt or like adapt. And I think like the latest papers that I've been seeing, we are seeing nowadays with this beginning of adoption of the DMA, what are the good things, or like what the good effects of the DMA. Maybe I'm seeing the papers that I'm reading are more like try to see the flaws, or like the not so good or negative impacts of the DMA. For example, the Google Maps, the prohibition of the self-preference between Google Search and Google Maps. So one thing when you're talking about not only Brazil, but Latin American countries or developing countries, is to have like this stand position to see, okay, let's see what's going on. We don't need to have the rush to adopt these kind of provisions. I'm not sure if it's really needed to be like the front space of this kind of discussion. And after having like some years or like some good experience of empirical evidence of what is going on, maybe we should or we can like have a better arguments in pro or against, in pros or cons of those kind of provisions that for sure will heavily impact the digital industries. So I think I answered your questions, and
Yes, indeed, you did. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dario, for sharing your thoughts on this very important issue. And I am coming to Pritika now for her perspective on India, where there is a draft digital competition bill proposing an ex-ante approach to monitoring large digital enterprises. Do you think that this regulation is important to your government? Is it a priority? And do you expect there to be any conflicts between the standards of competition law currently in place and like ex-ante regulation? What are your predictions?
Thank you, Monica, and thank you to the lab for having me. Just to preface, I'd like to say that these are my personal views and they don't reflect anybody that I work for. I think, yes, this is an important area for the government, and specifically over the recent times, the emphasis on digital regulation in the country. Aside from the Digital Competition Bill, you have the Digital India Bill, which is set to replace the IT Act. And then you have the broadcasting bill, where you have rumors and conversations about how content creators will fall under the purview if they categorize as digital news broadcasters. And that would mean a fair amount of regulations and a code of conduct to comply with there. You also have recently there was the COAI, which was looking to try to license OTT communication apps, just like telecom operators. And there was, while TRI's recommendations don't necessarily cover that area, there was that conversation as well. So this is just to give a brief understanding of what India is looking at, especially from a digital regulation perspective. And just in the interest of time, I'll jump to your second question. The biggest and the most glaring conflict concerning standard competition law and the digital competition bill is the fact that the Competition Act is an ex post approach, and the digital competition bill has an ex ante framework, which is going to be which it wants to put into place. And just like the EU's DMA, the bill adopts an ex-ante regulatory approach designed to proactively prevent potentially anti-competitive practices, whereas the Competition Act 2002, which is currently in place, the CCI looks at cases on a very case-by-case basis, and that is worked on for a multitude of cases, and the CCI and the regulatory environment has seen success when it comes to looking at digital platform cases under the purview of the Act. So I would think, and this is my opinion, that the bill is sort of a double-edged sword, because what it does is it qualifies certain platforms that provide core digital services as a systematically significant digital enterprise or an associated digital enterprise. And if you qualify under that, then you have to comply with certain obligations provided under the bill. And if you don't comply with those obligations, then you are possibly in contravention of the bill itself. Uh, and the CCI can take appropriate measures for that. So in my opinion, it seems more of a targeted approach, and it seems to be covering I think it looks more at preventing versus actually seeing what works under the law, and then accordingly seeing the approach. But so for me, I think yes, that there is a stark contrast there. I hope that answers your question.
Exactly, it does. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I would like to come back to the EU specifically, because now we have talked about the Brussels effect, right? And we still need to mention something that is very rarely talked about, and it is the European consensus, which is needed for an act to come into force, to take place. So with regards to the DMA, the DSA, the AI Act most recently, and many others, it is vital to note that they all fall into the European Commission's Europe's policy decade, which is from 2020 to 2030. And the main goal of this decade is to obtain digital sovereignty. So Lila, I would like to ask you, how do you think that the DMA specifically fits into this digital decade and digital sovereignty?
Thank you, Monica, for this very interesting question. In Europe, digital sovereignty means two things. One is to have the power to build tech in Europe and for Europe. And the other side of this is to keep foreign tech under strict control, or under specific circumstances, to keep foreign tech out of Europe via regulation. The DMA and similar laws serve the second pillar. So keeping foreign tech under rigorous control, but do not support promoting building tech in Europe and for Europe. The problem is that the second pillar, as I said, requires the first as a precondition. So none of the 7 gatekeepers is European under the current designation. There is no European big tech at this moment. Without innovative Europe, keeping out foreign tech makes no sense. As such, the DMAs right now does not support building European tech empire or digital sovereignty. Neither it encourages innovation. Innovative Europe needs to be a strategic priority for the next decades. The previous EU Commission emphasized making Europe fit for the digital age. Hanna Virkkunen, the current Commission's Commissioner for Tech Sovereignty and promoting EU standards internationally, and she has her portfolio building the digital sovereignty in Europe. While her efforts might limit the influence of foreign tech in Europe, they, under the current designation, they do little to foster the homegrown technological development within the EU. That is what Europe really needs to build tech. The recently published Draghi report highlights the need for more innovation and less bureaucracy. The report gets it right that Europe needs more innovation and less bureaucracy. When it comes to the digital sovereignty, the EU has the opportunity to choose its allies by deciding to treat every foreign actor the same adversarial way. So for example, both the USA and China and their companies, it is not helpful for a plethora of reasons, including building tech in Europe. If Europe wants to innovate, Europe needs to, or at least shall consider, to cooperate with American companies who bring innovation in Europe and foster with potential European competitors. Europe is already falling behind the USA and China in the digital competition sphere. If Europe keeps staying on this regulatory track and champions the regulatory competition without putting more effort in innovation, it will continue to decline. This does not serve the European interest or building European digital sovereignty. It's an opportunity now for the European Union to change the gears and start focusing on building tech instead of building the bureaucracy. Tech independence, enhanced cybersecurity, data protection can lead to a European digital sovereignty without sacrificing innovation. The DMA needs to be executed in a way that fosters European innovation and doesn't stifle it, and build independence without alienating foreign actors like US tech companies. Thank you very much for this question. I hope I could answer your question in a short time.
Yes, definitely. And I think that, of course, innovation must be a high priority, not just for the EU, but for all countries to move forward with our economy. And my next question is actually related to this relationship between countries related to innovation. I would like to ask Hannah if she thinks that the unity between the EU and Turkey currently around the DMA and this kind of approach to competition law is going to have possible side effects, such as worsening relationships between the US and Turkey.
Thanks, Monica. Let me maybe first elaborate a little bit on this, let's say, Brussels effects, specifically in Turkey, right? Because second part of the question, I would say, is a little bit political, right? So I can only suggest my opinions, which are not really expert ones. As for the impact of, in general, the impact of the EU in Turkey, we do feel it, of course. We all know that, okay, Turkey is not the EU member yet, let's see, but they do have a customs union with the EU and a customs union agreement for many, many years, and among which is the obligation to harmonize its laws with the EU rules and regulations, right? So let's face it, and this is something that I will not discover a wheel, right, or the bicycle. So EU does have the ability to set de facto global standards in various areas. So digital markets are no exceptions to this, and hence companies that wishing to operate in Europe, especially large tech firms, they must comply with the DMA. That's it, full stop, right? So it's currently what I understand is like, instead of creating, right, or create different business models for regions, such big tech, it's actually beneficial for them to adapt their practices worldwide that would align with the EU standards, and thus in such a way extending the influence of the DMA beyond Europe. Yes, we can talk about, of course, the negative sides of the DMA, that it's still an experiment kind of, right? The results of which, or the outcome of which is yet, the effects of which is yet to be seen and felt. But all in all, the main idea of it was to, on the opposite, to enhance the innovation, to promote the competition, and to make, I believe, the European market as well more competitive, right? We do talk about, of course, all of us heard the concerns voiced up by the US government, saying that this is only targeting the US companies somehow. Well, I believe that wasn't really the intention, right? Specifically, let's target US companies. It's just that, again, the US is a pioneer in these the digital markets, and somehow Europe feels the need to regulate, to discipline them. So I don't believe that this is a bad thing. It just, again, as I mentioned in the first part of my, in the first question, is that it's more about, let's leave aside the discussions, do we need DMA or not? Let's focus on how to improve it and how to really make it as a tool that would bring more innovation, right, and decrease the bureaucracy, as Lila correctly pointed out. I totally agree with that. We need less bureaucracy, that's for sure, right? Nobody likes bureaucracy, and especially I believe for the innovation, for the technological progress, we do not we need that as less as possible. So the only solution I see is to create a harmonized approach, let's say globally, right? Not only European markets, US markets, Turkey, like national one, right? So approach that only in such a way we can, I believe, decrease the bureaucracy, decrease the red tape, and in the long term, I believe it doesn't happen overnight. So that's something that in the long term, I believe, will create synergies for all the parties involved, right? So turning to the last part of the question, specifically on the relations with the US, how will this affect relations with the US? Well, from my perspective, right? So to be honest, I do not see how specifically this may worsen relation between Turkey and the US. Turkey simply follows, again, the global trend of regulating, disciplining the big tech companies for the benefit of the innovation, for the benefit of the competition, and for the benefit of all of us, right? It also complies with its international obligations, the customs union agreement that I mentioned, so to harmonize its laws with the EU standards. So it's part of its simply international obligation to comply with that. It's not something, let's say, it's more of we have a problem, right? So, and this process of harmonizing the Turkey laws with the US is inevitable because it's a part of the global regulatory effort to find a solution to the global problem, right? So it goes beyond the Brussels effect. It's part of the global trend that pushes for the stronger regulation of the digital markets. So in that sense, I would say nothing personal, right? So it's not something that US should think, okay, Turkey is doing it on purpose to worsen the relation. So that's my perspective. Again, I would repeat, I'm not a politician, I'm a lawyer, right? So I do not really see, the negative part on that side. Specifically in relation to DMA, there may be other questions, political questions, based on which the relations may get worse or better. But specifically talking that because Turkey is adopting the DMA provisions that will influence the relations between the two countries, I do not think so. So nothing personal in this respect.
Well, thank you so much. And it's such an interesting idea, this universal global approach to competition. So we will see what will happen in the future. These are really changing times that we are living through, and it's so great that we are able to have these discussions. So thank you for contributing. My next question will be to Dario, because I also want to get his perspective. The DMA places severe restrictions on data limitations and could make foreign investments much less profitable. So the Brazilian proposal covers Brazilian companies, of course, with an annual gross revenues exceeding 70 million Brazilian reals. And therefore, this bill that you have coming on might place significant burdens on several key players. How do you think that this would affect technological companies and specifically big tech companies that are in Brazil?
Perfect. Thank you for the question, Monica. So we're talking about the bill that we have in Brazil Congress right now, Bill 2768. It was submitted in 2022. And first of all, it's important to give this perspective that the bill is currently stuck in the Brazilian Congress. So since 2022 when it was submitted, but also last year we had some kind of discussions about this bill. But it's been, I believe, almost 1 year that this bill hasn't get any kind of development within the Congress. What we do have until now is this first draft, the original draft of the bill, and within this original draft, the rule to designate the Brazilians gatekeepers has a really low, very low threshold, which would be, as you said, Monica, this any actually any digital company that provides a digital service with a revenue exceeding 70 million reais, Brazilian reais, which would be around 14-15 million dollars, would be considered would be designated a gatekeeper. So in this sense, for example, the CCIA, the communication, the CCIA, the I forgot what is their whole name, but they estimated that if Brazil adopt like this threshold, we would have like around 187 companies being designated as gatekeepers, and that's why not only me, but I believe like we have a consensus in the Brazilian scholars that this bill must be heavily once we have like any kind of discussion about it, will be like heavily shifted and changed to something that will have some more credibility of what are the goals and what are the perspectives to regulate. Because if Brazil wants to adopt a regulation, extent regulation for digital markets, instead of having, for example, the DMA that have 6, 7, 8 companies, adopting a rule that would designate almost 200 companies as gatekeepers, for sure would be like a terrible scenario, because there's not even how to do it, this kind of thing on practice. But so that's one important part of my answer, is that the threshold that we have now with the original draft will probably not be the one that, if any kind of bill would be adopted, for sure this will not be the threshold for the final law. But in the other sense, what we do have now is in the first semester of this year, the Brazilian Ministry of Finance released and launched a public consultation, not specifically about this bill, but more specifically about what is the society thinking about the digital accent regulation in Brazil. And they received a lot of comments, but I believe like one of the most important comments that they received was the CADE's comments, the Brazilian Competition Authority comments, that for the first time said that it was in favor of adopting an accent regulation bill in Brazil. As they said, before or previously adopting some such kind of regulation, it's important to address like what are the failures of digital markets, specifically the Brazilian digital markets. So they were more like in the sense, we believe that some kind of bill is needed, although we're not sure what are the failures, the market failures that we want to address. This kind of gave a change in the Brazilian perspective, that okay, now we have the competition authority being in favor of this kind of regulation. So for the first time, this has been moving in a way to CADE, the Brazilian Competition Authority, but until right now, we do not really know if this kind of regulation will be passed. And just for finish it, what are the consequences for companies? I believe, like in a sense, as Hannah said, Brazil is also following some kind of global trend, although we are not sure if it's going to be adopted. But probably the EU has adopted and this is the thing about versus effect. EU is normally the first mover in these kinds of regulation, and they do try. As I see, at least for Brazil, probably the adoption of such kind of regulation will be followed by the same kind of obligations or same kind of way to comply it with the EU, the DMAs. So in a sense of, although some kind of burdensome for the companies, not that sure if it's going to be that different from a compliance if adopted than a EU style. that's being currently with the DMA. And I hope that I answered your question with this.
Thank you so much. I also think that the EU is the first to respond most of the time via regulation, like with the DMA, with the AI Act, and so on. But there is also a growing fear in India specifically that this ex ante regulation would have limits. It could limit market growth and stifle innovations because of its potential negative effects on companies, that they would leave the country simply. But do you think, Pritika, that a DMA type law is premature for your country, or is it very much needed?
I don't think there's a direct answer to that, to be very honest. But I do agree with your point that there is a fear of, stifling of innovation and market growth. Specifically, I want to focus on MSMEs and startups first because, there are a fair amount of MSMEs that look to collaborate with large tech firms in the country. And there possibly isn't anything anti-competitive about it, but with the bill like the digital competition bill, that could very well fall under the purview of the bill and attract a flood of obligations which could be required from them. And similarly for startups, because if they want to reach a certain level of growth or they are looking to enter the market, they are immediately hindered by the thresholds that are there in place for SSDEs, which is systematically significant digital enterprises and associated digital enterprises. And I think if you look at the Telegram example with respect to the DSA, Digital Services Act, you can see that, EU tech regulators are very closely monitoring Telegram's user base because under the DSA, you have certain thresholds for very large online platforms or very large online search engines. And that could invite a fair amount of strict regulations to be complied with if they reach that threshold. So I think from a threshold point of view, that could stifle innovation. And to echo Leela and Hannah's point, innovation is key. Um, um, you know, Also looking at associated digital enterprises, the fact that a group or a entity within the group of companies, if they are even minorly associated with the SSDE for that matter, they could be considered as an associated digital enterprise, and then they have to comply. So yeah, so there is a sort of a premonition of some sort, actually an apprehension of some sort, that this could possibly stifle innovation and could deter companies coming into the market. And that would be sad because India's tech industry is booming right now. There is reports of it, of the digital media market tripling by 2030. You have exponential growth reports coming through. And in that situation, to see that a law like this could possibly hinder that growth and that, you know, seeing how the economy could actually just take off, it is a little concerning. And I also want to point out that regulation is needed and it is necessary, but it's also necessary to look at the actual tech ecosystem in the country. And I want to bring forward Leela's point again that it's not one size fits all. So in my case, in my opinion, I would say, because the digital competition bill has been delayed because of changes in ministries and whatnot, I would think that this would be a good opportunity for lawmakers and policymakers to reflect and study the tech ecosystem, see what is actually required in the tech ecosystem from a regulation perspective, and then take any action towards the digital competition bill in specific. And also to, as a conclusive point, the DMA was worked on for 2 years and it hasn't been in effect for very long. So its results the results of its implementation are unsure, and there isn't really a successful precedent necessarily at the moment to showcase that it's really, really helpful. From that regard, you can see that it's not the best possible idea to follow in its footsteps. So if you were to ask me if it's premature or not, I don't necessarily have a direct answer for that, but these are my points of view on why it's not entirely required that India follow in the DMA's footsteps and implement a bill that is as vast as the digital competition bill.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Pritika. I also think that it's quite interesting that you also mentioned that we need some time to really have conclusive remarks on the DMA's effects in the future. So to finish off, I would like to ask all of our esteemed panelists to give a few remarks, a few sentences of what they think is their takeaway from the event, what they think about the DMA's Brussels effect in general. So please, Lila, can you start?
Thank you very much for the question and for the opportunity to wrap it up. Thank you again. So regarding the DMA, I think it's very important to emphasize that this is just one out of several regulatory paths or non-regulatory paths, but solution for how to tackle big tech. If other countries like India and Brazil are blindly following the EU's pathway, they might have some tensions with American companies and American cooperation in a bigger picture. Regarding the digital sovereignty question, I think that the EU shall focus more on innovation and less on bureaucracy, as I emphasized during my talk before. And putting more emphasis on innovation is just vital, and also to cooperate with its allies, with the European allies, mostly with American companies. Thank you very much for the opportunity again, for the lab, for all of you.
Thank you for being here. Which one of you would like to reflect to Lila's points and also give your remarks? Hannah, please.
As a final, to wrap it up, right? So I believe that the DMA Brussels effect offers a template, right? A template that countries, non-EU countries, can use as an example for their national rules, right? Making it a practical tool for crafting their own success stories, right? So we are talking here for the template that will not be bluntly simply copy and paste, right? But a template that then will be kind of used and applied in with the peculiarities, with the national peculiarities. So this process of becoming a success story, it kind of occurs independently of the regulation under the Brussels effect. So regardless of what it is, whether it's effective, whether it's correct. So, and this is the most, I would say, miraculous aspect of the Brussels effect. So by following the EU footsteps, right, one can, in a sense, legitimate oneself under any circumstances. So I do not want to praise the DMA because there are some pitfalls, all right, and it's still an experiment, as I mentioned before. But the DMA Brussels effect is driving a more harmonized approach to the digital market regulation on a global scale, which I cannot deny is a beneficial, particularly for businesses, right? For authorities as well, for regulators as well, but businesses are first, the first ones that should benefit from this more legal certainty and more predictability. So this harmonization indeed will bring at some point more legal certainty and clarity for businesses, which is something that we're striving for in order to increase innovation, in order to bring more innovation. So that's my final thoughts for the success stories at the national level.
Yes, thank you so much for being with us, Hannah, and contributing to our success story, hopefully. Dario, what are your thoughts on these issues, and could you reflect to the other two speakers?
Perfect. Thank you, Monica. I also agree with Hannah that the DMA has given a first template of ex-ante digital markets regulation. However, internationally speaking, I believe the countries that are discussing this kind of regulations kind of drifting up apart from the DMA and going to a direction more similar to the UK example for the MCC that does not give clear and like first strictive rules and obligations, and more in a sense to trying to understand the markets, that the digital markets that they want to regulate, and what should be and kind of regulation to tailor and to solve those directly and specific problems. And in this sense, just finishing and talking about Brazil, we're not really sure about what is going to be the consequence, and I'm not even sure that not only Brazil but other countries is being in favor of adopting an exempt regulation. But those that are being in favor also believe like not going to the specifically to the DMA way to regulate it. And yeah, let's see it how things going. For sure, we're gonna have another events to talk about those kind of regulation. And thank you once again for the invitation, and thank you for having this great panel together.
Thank you for coming to our panel and for sharing your thoughts. And lastly, I would like to ask Pritika to summarize her opinions.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you everyone for organizing this event. It was really, really interesting to hear everyone's perspective. I'm going to borrow a little from what Hannah and Dario have said and just focus on the fact that, yes, it's important to consider the national peculiarities of the market itself before formulating a law, especially, with focusing on India, with an industry that is growing and is encouraging startups and development and innovation. I would genuinely think that lawmakers and policymakers would want to take a minute and take a step back and just decide on whether it's required to follow completely blanketly with a law that is not entirely conducive to their own environment. So I think the bottom line is, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So that's all I have to say. But thank you so much.
Thank you for coming to us and being here with us today. And finally, after this fruitful discussion, firstly, I want to say that the audience, if we are not able to take your questions at this time, please still share it with us, and I will make sure that they reach the panelists and then they can answer your questions directly. But finally, I want to turn it over to our funding director, Aurelian Portuguese. So Aurelian, please give us your concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica. Thank you for these very interesting discussions. I think when I hear all these thoughts, I think it's interesting to see that the DMA still remains an attractive and appealing type of regulations for a number of countries all over the world. And perhaps it's important yet for a number of regulators all over the world to just give some thought and pause and see what's going on with the DMA, at least in Europe, and what are the pitfalls, or at least the risks with the DMA. First, as it has been said, we don't have a lot of background with the DMA. The DMA got into effect only in March 2024, so only a few months ago. And right after, I mean, the point of the DMA was to really intervene quickly in the market and to avoid protracted litigation. And what we see is precisely the opposite. Like right after in-compliance took place with the DMA, we saw non-compliance decisions against gatekeepers, and those non-compliance decisions are brought to court. So we are starting litigation processes that's going to take years in order to find out what the DMA means to a specific company, to a specific service. So the idea of a timely interventions and quick ex ante type of regulations is already kind of like broken, because we don't have like de facto self-executing obligations, as we say. The second thing is, I mean, we just saw a few days ago, the Draghi report. And I think the idea that Europe wants a type of regulations, and there's a massive consensus. Yes, there was a massive consensus in the European Parliament when the DMA was adopted, but the consensus is broken well and done since then. There's increasingly some push inside Europe It started with the telecoms, then the train company with the blocked merger between Alstom and Siemens. And then we see it with the digital companies, where this idea of like breaking down companies, making them small, and not having sort of like national champions is problematic. And there's a pushback inside Europe by a number of thinkers, academia, but also business leaders, saying that we need to focus perhaps more on competitiveness rather than pure fair competition. And so that's something that it's a really paradigm shift. Interestingly, in the Draghi report, they mentioned those regulations as being precautionary, anti-type of innovation. I wrote extensively about precautionary antitrust and the fact that those regulations, and specifically the DMA, has a precautionary philosophy which conflict somehow with an innovation-driven agenda. So I think it's very telling that the Draghi report is a paradigm shift in terms of like waking up, or at least opening their eyes of the unintended consequences of the DMA when it comes to the precautionary approach. Third thing is, which I will say to perhaps developing to other countries who wants to regulate the DMA, is that we talked a lot about killer acquisitions and the fact that some large companies may buy smaller companies just to kill these acquisitions. So first of all, the DMA doesn't do anything when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. The regulation, I think it's Article 22, is very weak. It's just a notification requirement. But increasingly, we just had the judgment against Illumina and Grail, where the European Commission tried to revive the Article 22 on the European merger regulations to tackle killer acquisitions. And the European Court of Justice just delivered a massive blow to the European Commission's reinterpreting Article 22. So what I'm saying is, not only the main concerns about tech companies was the killer acquisitions, and the DMA doesn't fix that, but when the European Commission tried to fix it or tried to address it, the European Court of Justice just delivered a pushback saying that this is not legally possible and economically desirable. And final point is perhaps to say that there's, of course, why are we talking about Brussels effects? We're talking about Brussels effects because Europe is 500 million inhabitants and the second economy in the world. So when you regulate, you almost cannot avoid this market, and you cannot have this power. And of course, there's no Brussels effect if you're a tiny little country and where there's no investment and there's no real digital. So I want to raise the warning, saying that for the smaller the company, the smaller the country, the less it will be possible to have these kind of attractive regulations where there won't be any kind of unintended consequences. There will be massive consequences in terms of investments, in terms of how investors invest in a country. They are not really welcomed in terms of regulations. So I think Europe could afford the cost related with the DMA, and that's not the case for a number of countries that may not be able to afford it, because investors would just like vote with their feet and invest where it's the most welcoming regulatory environment. So there is definitely a trade-off between these type of regulations and the level of investment. Europe can get away with it because it's so big and so just unavoidable, but it would be the case for a number of smaller jurisdictions and smaller markets. So we just at the start of the compliance with the DMA, which started in March 2024, and we see a lot of pushback in terms of the non-compliance. We were told there won't be litigations. Well, the first things happening is litigation, and also in terms of intellectual thinking, the Draghi report will have massive consequences in the way you enforce the DMA and the way you think about regulation, even inside Europe. We see it with the new composition of the European Commission, where it's a real change in terms of the persona and personalities that have been attributed with the competition portfolio. So just perhaps a way of warning, and thank you so much for at least having this comparative overview of the DMA globally and how other countries may think about it. But we're only at the start of this regulatory journey, which may have a lot of unintended consequences. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all again for being here, and we hope to see you again some other time and to further our discussions about the DMA's Brussels effect. Thank you and goodbye, everyone.